Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, the host of the podcast. Hunter is here with me. H, thanks for being here.
Autumn, thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation today about a very controversial issue right now in our state.
Yes, we paused from what we had anticipated recording today because we wanted to talk about a bill that has passed the Colorado State House, and has gone on to the Colorado State Senate, and it is creating a lot of discussion on a national level, but it's happening here in Colorado, and is something that we thought it would be good to discuss and respond to and consider today.
There's a couple of reasons I thought it would be good for us to discuss this. One is I think it raises an issue that convictional Christians, especially Christian parents, are going to have to be aware of and thinking through for the foreseeable future, especially here in Colorado. And then secondly, it not only has gotten attention here in our state, but lots of larger national media outlets, both secular and Christian, have weighed in on this. And so it's something that I know just by the volume of attention it's getting that our people are probably going to be thinking about, the people I pastor are going to be thinking and asking about. And part of what I love to do on this podcast is just kind of what you say every week in the introduction. It's a conversation between the pastors of the church and the church at large, and it's a chance for us to just discuss what's going on in our world and in our culture and how we respond to that and live as faithful, convictional Christians in the midst of a very pluralistic world. So for that reason, I know this is a hot issue and it's worth our time and attention. So thanks for pivoting from your well-laid plan. I think we were gonna talk about history, church history,
yeah,
right?
We were.
The good thing about church history is it'll still be there next week.
It sure will.
Yeah.
I'm not too terribly concerned about that. But we do have minimal time left before your sabbatical, Hunter.
That's correct.
So
yeah.
We'll only end up recording a couple more of these podcasts together before you are out for a while.
I'm going to be out on sabbatical this summer, May, June, and July, and have some great time away planned and some things I'm excited to focus on. But none of those is recording podcasts with you. In fact, I have to be very disciplined. Like, there's parts of my job I love. This is one of them. I have to be disciplined not to pick those things up while I'm on sabbatical.
Yes.
So thanks for giving me that.
We definitely want it to be a time of refreshment, and we'll be glad to have you back on the podcast when you return from sabbatical. So
we'll see if you invite me back. That's the running joke. We'll see if you want me back.
We'll see if my summer guests just, are so good that really your presence isn't needed. I don't anticipate that, though.
Fred, our executive pastor, is great at saying when you go on sabbatical, you hand off a lot of things that you're doing, and it's an opportunity for you to ask, should I put these back on my plate when you come back? So you might have to convince me to come back on the Vision for Life podcast. We'll see what kind of name, image, and likeness deal you can come up with.
I'll just play
while
back.
I'm away.
I'll just play back that
I'll have
bit.
my people reach
Remember
out.
What you just said? Like, this is one of the parts of your job that you enjoy.
That's right.
So I'll just play
That's
that
right.
back for you, and it'll.
Okay.
I'm sure you'll be back. Yeah. Well, today we are going to discuss, as I said, a bill that has passed to the Colorado State House, and it is Colorado House Bill 25-1312. It's also called the Kelly Loving Act. And I think first we should discuss what is in this bill. Why is it titled as it is, and what is being proposed in this bill?
That's a great way to start, and I'm going to let you do that. Tell us what's in it.
There are a couple of articles that we'll link to that you and I have read. And so I'm going to use one of those articles. It was published in Mere Orthodoxy. We've discussed articles from Mere Orthodoxy on the podcast before. And at the beginning of this article, I think it does a good job summarizing what is in House Bill 1312. So I'm going to read a few of their points, their summary points. So one of the propositions in this bill what it does is it would define misgendering, dead naming, and threatening to out a trans person as forms of coercive control. And the way that it is phrased in the bill is also specifically related to, in one section of the bill, custody cases.
Okay.
So in instances in which two parents disagree, they have a child who wants to identify as something other than their biological gender, and one parent might disagree with that child's decision, then this bill would make that parent liable to have their parental rights revoked in a custody case. And I think maybe we should just, for sake of clarity, make sure that we understand and that our listeners understand what misgendering or dead naming is. And so misgendering would be if a person identifies as something other than their biological sex and has decided to use other pronouns to indicate what gender they want to be recognized as, then misgendering would be to call someone something other than their preferred pronouns. So that's misgendering. If a man chooses to identify as a woman and someone calls him he, that is misgendering according to this law. So that's how it's understood. And then dead naming would be if a child has chosen, because this bill is specifically talking about minors. So it could have implications beyond that, but it's specifically talking about minors in this instance. So if a child has chosen, taken a name, or is being called by a name other than their given name, and in a custody case, a parent were to call them by their given name, then that is what is called dead naming. That would be what's being criminalized in this bill.
And these are very personal and thorny and emotional issues for families to walk through. I've recently been talking with some parents who have a biological son who now identifies as a woman, and one of the real points of tension, they're just trying to maintain a relationship. And one of the real points of tension in maintaining the relationship has been dad has sometimes called the son who now identifies as a woman by his name that they gave him, and their son would say, "You're dead naming me," and so this is a thorny issue that really affects relationships, and it's often, for parents in this situation, it's often not clear what they should do or how they should approach this, and they're wrestling and they're praying and they're thinking, and there's a lot of conversation about that. And what this introduces is that whole family dynamic process, that families have to work through, now has the government looking in on it and saying, we're going to put our finger on the scale and tell you what conclusion you have to come to in order to maintain custody. Or if parents disagree, and I'm sure that can happen a lot, they're not quite in the same place, they disagree, that becomes potentially something one parent could use against the other in a custody case. And so, I think of it like, how does this affect real people? And I think it just makes walking through a very hard situation even worse for them. So that's kind of one concern I would have with this bill. And then there's a more principled kind of concern, which is that I think most convictionally Christian parents don't believe that transgender ideology is true and accurate. And so they are trying to navigate, when they try to navigate this, they're going to navigate this standpoint of, I don't believe this is true and accurate, so how do I navigate this? And this kind of imposes upon them a worldview that says, no, you have to accept everything in the transgender kind of movement as true and accurate. So it causes them to have to be forced to either violate your Christian convictions or face the legal consequences of that. So I'm concerned about it from just a principled, I want people to be free to live by their convictions. I want Christians to be able to live by Christian convictions. And you still can live by Christian convictions even if the state says it's illegal and will punish you for it or in some way, it's going to be very costly, right? So I just don't want people to be punished for living by Christian convictions if we can help it.
Mm-hmm. Mm. It is good to think about the real implications of the points being proposed in this bill, in the ways that it would impact families, some families who we know are walking through a difficult situation and seeking both to love their children well and to navigate, as you said, an issue that is contrary to what they see as true and good. Another of the points in this bill is that it would ensure or enforce that schools adopt chosen name policies that are inclusive of any reason why a child might choose a specific name. So it so far would be affecting parents and then also educators. And the language in the bill as it is stated doesn't create a separate category for religious schools or private schools. Right now it just says all schools in a local area. Yeah. So it would be something that could potentially be enforced in all different forms of schools. And so it's stating that the school would have to not only say that they would use that child's given name, but put in place a policy that makes it mandatory to use any name a child might choose to go by.
Yeah. And I think another concern that many are raising is that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission doesn't have a good track record of respecting religious liberty and has actually lost several Supreme Court cases around that, and yet tends to still be very aggressive in enforcing their view of things over and against religious liberty. There's the well-known case of the Masterpiece Bakery in Lakewood, just a suburb here west of Denver, and the owner there has been through a long battle with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. And I think there's a concern that the Colorado Civil Rights Commission would use legislation or laws like this in a way that would be pretty aggressive. And I don't think any Christians are desiring more conflict with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, but that is the reality on the ground in our state. And we have a very aggressive Civil Rights Commission who, even though they lose Supreme Court battles, tends to still come back and continue to fight these. And that has real consequences for people. Like, even if they ultimately win at the Supreme Court level, they still have, their life is disrupted by going through this long, protracted legal battle. There's financial and just life, consequences to that. So for all of these reasons, I see a lot of people, I think, rightly concerned about this legislation in our state.
Mm. There are a couple of I'll just summarize a couple of other points in the law. One, it says, would prohibit Colorado courts from applying or enforcing transphobic laws from other states that would threaten the custody of parents who have allowed their children to receive gender-affirming health care. So this is another way that the law could potentially impact parents. If there are other jurisdictions, other states around Colorado that have different laws in place, but the child came to Colorado to seek any sort of care, then it could also threaten parental rights in those instances. Another way that it could potentially impact schools is that it states that there cannot be any gender-segregated dress codes and guarantees students the right to abide by any dress code variation. And then finally, a final statement in the bill is that it defines misgendering and dead naming as discriminatory acts in the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act and prohibits them in places of public accommodation. So there are, I think, a few different categories. One is the direct way that it could potentially impact parents, the way that it would impact all local schools. And then there are even these broader implications in that final point for the general public, and especially in public places like places of business.
Yeah. And one other note we should probably make here is that the sponsors of this bill, and there's two sponsors in the House, it originated in the Colorado House, and then there's two sponsors in the Senate. The sponsors of this bill have chosen to name it the Kelly Loving Act. And I haven't seen this talked about that much, but I think it's actually important for Christians, as we're commenting on this, to consider this. Often bills are named something that in some ways, the name itself advocates for the bill and tries to make it hard to resist, or it puts a euphemistic name on the bill that kind of promotes its positive characteristics and maybe doesn't, acknowledge the other side of it. So that's a normal thing in all legislation, both at the state and the national level. Kelly Loving was a transgender woman who was killed in the Club Q shooting in 2022 in Colorado Springs. And so there's the presenters of this bill, the sponsor of this bill, would say their desire is to protect the livelihood of transgender identifying children. And so we should protect their life. And they would believe that not allowing those children to pursue their chosen gender identity is harmful to them, is threatening to their life. And so they're kind of positioning this as we're trying to protect the lives of transgender people and honor the memory of Kelly Loving. So one of the things that I think it's really important for Christians to be able to say and have to say is we also believe in protecting the lives of all people, including those who identify as transgender. And no convictional Christian wants to do anything to promote violence against transgender people. In fact, we should be at the forefront of defending the lives of all people. And the question gets more granular, which is what is good for children? Mm-hmm. What is good for children? And there's a real difference of conviction about what is good or versus what is harmful for children. And also, so I think we should just say that, and we need to say that as we're speaking against this. We're not, in advocating against this, we're not advocating some kind of violence against transgender people. We're interested in protecting their lives. And then I think for parents to know, for you to affirm the way God created your child as male or female, for you as a parent to mirror to your child, you are a man or you are a woman, even if they're confused about that, or you're a boy, you're a girl, even if they're confused about that, is good. It's good for them. And I don't think you have to even, although I think the scientific evidence is starting to show, and this is mentioned in one of the articles we'll link here, the scientific evidence is starting to show that a lot of the gender therapy, the medical gender therapy, is not effective or good. I think there's good scientific reasons or data reasons to say this may not be good for children. We can still know that's the truth just based on what God says and biblical Christian theology. What is good is for people to embrace that they are male or female and to embrace the way God made them as male or female. And it's also good for parents. God put you in those children's lives. He made you their parents. And part of your job as parents is to reflect reality to your children. Even when your children are confused on reality, part of your job is to protect children. So I would advise any Christian parent for you to affirm and mirror back to your child that they're a boy or a girl according to the way God made them is good for them. And you don't need to wait for more data to come out about that. For you to be unclear on that is bad for your children. And so I have a very strong conviction about what I would advise parents to do, in this case. I don't want parents to be intimidated by legislation like this, to think I can't just mirror back to my children who God made them.
I'm glad you put that into you framed that question a different way, Hunter. You said this brings us to this question, what is good for children? There's a term in the bill that I've seen discussed a bit on social media, and it says that dead naming or misgendering, especially when done by parents to children, is a form of coercive control. So the bill is claiming, the writers of this bill are claiming, based on, like you said, their answer to that question, what is good for children, that if a parent is to call a child their given name, that is a form of coercive control. And so I appreciate it that you're asking it that way and saying, we would say biblically that calling your child his or her given name is good.
That's right. And you gave them that name as a parent, and it's good that you name them. That's God's creation order. And we talked in previous podcasts, we've done episodes on like Strange New World by Carl Trueman that demonstrates there's a whole ideological worldview behind the conviction that not using the child's given name that you gave them would somehow be harmful or bad. So there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into that conviction. And those assumptions are just that. They're assumptions. They're not proven. They are, we would say, they're leaps of faith. And I think in the course of time and history, and ultimately in the course of the kingdom of God coming in full, those assumptions will be proven to be false and unreliable and bad. And so there's a real difference of strong conviction about what is and is not good for children here. And I don't want Christian parents to be weakened in their conviction that just fulfilling their God-given responsibility as parents to name their children, which is good, and to reflect to their children, you're a boy or a girl according to who God made you. That's good.
And that there's not one, we've talked about this in previous episodes too. A part of that is understanding there's not one way to be a boy to be a girl.
That's right.
But the fact that you were created this way, that you're made this way is good.
That's right.
And of course, we're discussing this like has to be done in these sorts of conversations, but with a level of generality. And so we understand that even in reference to some specific situations that we know about in the lives of people who we know and love, where they are navigating this. As your children get older and begin to make decisions for themselves, then there are, of course, different nuances to this conversation, to the conversation not about whether this legislation is appropriate or not, and not about whether or not this practice of seeing your child's God-given biology, sexual makeup, name as good and as reflective of this creation order. But we do understand that as your children get older and make different decisions, that the nuances about how you have to handle that in your practical day-to-day life also change and take on certain aspects that are specific to that to that circumstance and to the conversation in your family.
I'm glad you're raising that, because this bill is about children. It's about when they are minors, and even legally, to be a minor means that you are under the authority of your parents. You that's what it means to be a minor. You can't simply run your own life, and we've set that out legally, I think, because it reflects the goodness of the way God made us to work. You know, it's like there's a certain age at which you become an adult legally, and then you have freedom from your parents in ways that you don't as a minor. So this is about, how do parents treat their children who are minors? How are they forced to treat their children who are minors? And what this bill says is you have to actually parent your children in a certain way, or if you don't parent them in a certain way, we're going to weigh that in a custody case. You're bringing up the issue of, what about if your adult children are identifying as transgender? That becomes a different question. Mm-hmm. And so you may navigate that differently if you're dealing with an adult child that's part of what it means to be an adult. You're free to make a lot of decisions for yourself. And what do you do if your adult children are identifying as a different gender than they were born as? That's how you navigate that's going to probably flesh out differently than if they're a child in your home and your job is literally as a parent to a minor to mirror reality to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you mentioned too, in one of the articles, it says there's something conspicuously missing from this bill, which is addressing whether or not medical transition and gender affirming care in a medical sense. So anything that sends a child down a medicalized route, starting with, it typically begins with some sort of therapy, but then that often there's data that says it transitions pretty quickly into the use of puberty blockers, and then sometimes gets into more and more invasive medical procedures and interventions. There's a mounting body of evidence that says that path specifically for minors, the data that has been collected, is around centers that had treated minors. So there's this mounting body of evidence that it's not proven to be helpful or successful. And so, as you pointed out, Hunter, I'm glad you pointed out, we can know that convictionally already. And what's being revealed in some of these, I think the one with the most name recognition is probably the Cass report that came out of the United Kingdom, because they conducted it through their National Institutes of Health, that revealed that the path of medicalization was not successful, specifically to treat the sort of harmful mental health effects that children who were experiencing gender dysphoria were, that the medicalization route didn't actually ease those adverse mental health effects that they were experiencing, and perhaps in some cases suicidality. So I'm glad that this article also pointed out that the bill isn't addressing that at all, even though it's being had really on an international, that conversation is being had on an international level at the moment.
And in the Gospel Coalition article, we'll link to this. Joe Carter does a good job under the little heading Missing Medical Context. He does a good job of summarizing some of this. So if our listeners are unfamiliar with that, they could get some good links there to read up on that. Europe is further along than the U.S. right now in recognizing, I think, what is starting to be a pretty clear scientific, trend. And so I think we should weigh that, especially as we're making laws that may be based on really shaky foundations. And back to our original point, though, Christians would be like, we already knew this. We can know based on God's word and the worldview that we learn in Scripture that God creates us male and female, and that's to be male is to bear the image of God, be female is to bear the image of God, and it is not something that's up to us to determine. It's given to us by Him. And so healthy spiritually and emotionally and psychologically healthy humanity is bringing your self-perception into line with reality that God created. That's just true across the board in all kinds of things and situations in life. And so we could have known this intuitively without a lot of data. Someone told me recently, like, I don't have a lot of data evidence, but it seems anecdotally that if I don't provide gender affirming care, that's bad for my children, and I'm like, actually, the data suggests that it's not necessarily good for your children to provide, quote, gender affirming medical care. And the biblical worldview would tell you that healthiness is coming into line with reality that God has made. And so I feel like I want to strengthen the resolve of Christian parents to simply live according to the biblical worldview and trust the Lord with whatever may come. I'm not saying that's going to just solve all your problems and make everything go super smoothly, but to trust God in that.
So, Hunter, let's ask then together, how should we respond? So this bill we've mentioned already could potentially directly impact parents, educators, and then the broader public in various ways. How should Christians respond to a bill of this sort that we see very clearly as being opposed to God's good design and opposed to God's design for families?
Yeah. I think the first thing, and I've been doing this since I became aware of it, and I actually became aware of it kind of late because the week it passed the House, I was on vacation fishing and not checking social media. So when we become aware of these things, though, since I've become aware of it, I've just been praying, just been praying that it would die. This bill would die. And it doesn't. In fact, that's even the way I'm praying. It doesn't have to be defeated just to die. If the Senate, the Colorado Senate, chooses not to take any action at all on this, like the Senate president could choose not to assign it to a committee, and if he doesn't assign it to a Senate committee, it'll die. If he assigns it to a Senate committee one day before the Senate session expires, it won't make it through committee. It'll die. So a bill doesn't have to be voted down in order to not make it through. And so, like, I'm praying for that man who actually know to be a Christian. He's been a believer. He's a believer. He's represented himself as a public Christian in many different contexts. And so I'm praying for him that God would give him wisdom and discernment and courage to do what is just and what is right before the Lord, and not just to please people in this situation. And he can use his authority and his power to help ensure that this bill dies a quiet death. And so I'm praying for James Coleman, and who's the Senate president, and a man who I've really respected. So let's pray. That's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is, to me, this is heightening the importance of being aware of what's happening legislatively, and often issues like this, where they're really going to impact us, come through the state and local level more than just what's happening at the national level. So if you live in Texas, you're probably not in danger of a bill like this ever making it through the Texas legislature. But what happens at your state and local level really does matter, and so it's good for Christians to be aware and just to engage. And to engage is often by contacting your representatives or contacting your senators and letting them know your convictions on this. The more they understand this is how politicians work. They have to understand the political consequences of choosing a certain course. And so if, for example, the Senate president who I just referenced, if he understands that there are real political consequences for him of people who are going to be opposed now to his leadership because he has acted in this way, he's going to weigh that in how he chooses to think and act. And so part of political activism is you don't have to be angry and divisive. You don't even have to go down and protest, but you do have to let your representatives know how their decisions impact you. And if they don't ever hear that from you, then they won't know.
So we can pray. We can be aware of what's happening in our local and state context. And in instances like this, take action by contacting our representatives. Are there any other points you would make under how should we respond? What else can we do in moments like this? We being Christians, the church, especially the church in Colorado right now.
Yeah, and I think the third thing is just keep living by God's word and biblical convictions, even if it becomes more and more costly. So there's a long civil disobedience tradition where if the government has enacted an unjust law, Christians peacefully choose not to obey that law and suffer the consequences of it. Martin Luther King was a great proponent of that. And there's kind of some irony here, but the Christians who would need to obey God rather than man in this case would just be living in the legacy of Dr. King by choosing to peacefully disobey an unjust law and letting the government do whatever they choose to do in response to that. And sometimes their response exposes the weakness and the untruthfulness of their law.
Yeah. Legislation doesn't change the truth of who we are as God's image bearers. It doesn't change the God-given role of parents to love their children, to disciple them, and to raise them to know God and walk in his ways, to see themselves and their bodies as good, God-given gifts. I want to go back to one thing you mentioned, Hunter, before we conclude our conversation today. You said, there's a chance that this bill might just die, and we can pray for that. But why is it important to still have this conversation and to have conversations like this?
Yeah, we're recording this conversation on Thursday, April 17th. And there is a chance that this bill will not make it through. And the Senate, it has not yet been assigned to a Senate committee as of today, Thursday, April 17th. The Senate is not in session tomorrow on Good Friday. And so we'll see next week, if in the next couple of weeks, if it makes it through a Senate committee. It may not. By the time this goes out, it may be dead. But I think this still raises an issue that Christians are going to have to think about. How do they live faithfully with? And so even if this particular instance doesn't come to fruition, which I pray it won't, I think there's still a cultural issue as it pertains to both the state's power, the government's power, and kind of Christian convictions being different from what many in our world would hold, and what that means to live according to those. And I also know I've been thinking about this a lot because I chose to kind of put some things out in public about my own convictions about this, and I was really bummed that I had to do that on Holy Week, because my energy, my passion this week is not about talking about this. My passion, energy is to share the gospel of Jesus with as many people as possible. Our church has been praying a 24/7 prayer chain this week. I'm planning to preach in a way that would invite all people everywhere to consider the claims of Jesus. That's my heartbeat. It's I want to reach as many people as possible with the gospel, and it can often feel like speaking up on issues like this are in tension with that desire to reach people and to welcome people to explore Jesus. At our church, we say we want to help people discover and follow the original Jesus, and I that's what I want to do. And so where I kind of start to wrestle is going man, if I speak up on this, what if my neighbors who probably have different convictions about this and I'm friends with on Facebook, what if they read that and that prevents them from coming to church on Easter, which I would really love, And unfortunately, though, I think all of this is part of my calling. It's part of my calling as a pastor to shepherd the people God has entrusted to my care. It's part of my job as a pastor to help them think through issues like this. As a citizen, I need to let my representatives know that I'm here and I'm part of their constituency. And I want to help as many people discover and follow Jesus. And so part of my own processing has been, sometimes I don't get to choose the timing and all of this. And I do want to keep my emphasis on praying for the lost and inviting them and doing evangelism and hospitality and preaching in a way that's for believers and non-believers alike. I'm going to keep my emphasis there. But I actually think it's part of our Christian witness that we also articulate thoughtfully, intelligently the Christian worldview on these issues, and I trust that God will sort that out.
Well, Hunter, thank you for having this conversation with me today. And to those of you listening, we enjoy hearing from you. So if you have questions about today's podcast or suggestions about what you'd like us to discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.